Trump swamps rivals with huge cash haul while DeSantis fundraising slows. President Biden saw boosts from small donors. Former President Donald Trump reported a huge cash advantage, and several candidates spent more than they raised. With less than 100 days before the Iowa caucuses, the 2024 presidential candidates were required to file their third-quarter fundraising reports by midnight Sunday. Former President Donald Trump reported a huge cash advantage over his Republican rivals at the end of September, a haul bolstered by his pleas to his donors to aid his effort as he is set to face multiple legal trials next year. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' fundraising slowed this quarter, as he retooled his campaign to focus more on Iowa. Senator Tim Scott, SC, entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy, North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum and former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson all spent more than they raised this quarter, while DeSantis and former Vice President Mike Pence spent nearly all the money their campaigns raised. Here are a few takeaways from the third-quarter disclosures filed with the Federal Election Commission. Trump dominates in contributions as legal woes mount. Trump far outpaced his Republican rivals in fundraising in the three-month period from July through the end of September, raising more than $24.5 million for his campaign. He began October with $37.5 million in cash to spend, according to reports filed with the FEC on Sunday night. It was not clear from the available data how much of his cash could be used for the primary election. The disclosures underscored the former president's dominance in the Republican field and how his supporters view his baseless assertions that he is the victim of a corrupt justice system, driving legions to contribute to his campaign. During the three-month period through the end of September, he campaigned far less than many of his rivals, and his campaign spent just $9.5 million on his re-election effort, just under 40% of what he raised, one of the lowest ratios among Republican candidates. DeSantis fundraising slows as campaign focuses on Iowa. DeSantis had entered the field with considerable bravado earlier this year, as allies framed his fundraising prowess in Florida and the well-funded super PAC aligned with his bid as a juggernaut that could catapult him into a two-man race with Trump. But his campaign overspent in its early days, prompting layoffs and raising questions about its viability, all as DeSantis fell further behind Trump in the polls. The latest fundraising report reflects that effort to rein in costs, which DeSantis' team says has set him on a more sustainable course. His campaign expenditures in September totaled about $1.4 million, down from nearly $4 million in August and nearly $6 million in June. His campaign said he entered October with about $5 million available for the primary, less money than what his top rivals have reported. The campaign said the $5 million accounts for about $1 million in unpaid invoices that appear in its third-quarter report. DeSantis' fundraising also has slowed considerably since his campaign launch, when top donors gathered in Miami to work the phones. He raised $20 million in the 6 weeks after his announcement. In the third quarter running from July 1 through September 30, he brought in $15.1 million through a campaign committee and a joint fundraising committee, which is also raising money for a leadership PAC that was not required to file its disclosures Sunday night. Money raised through the leadership PAC cannot be used to pay for campaign costs. DeSantis saw a spike in contributions toward the end of September, as he swung through the West Coast for the second GOP debate and held high-dollar fundraising events. He saw a similar surge at the end of the second quarter. Despite cost cutbacks, DeSantis still spending big on private air travel. Private plane companies were a major expense for DeSantis in the third fundraising quarter, even as his campaign sought to cut costs. His campaign paid more than $1.5 million to at least 6 companies that provide private jets: Advanced Aviation Team, Avion Aviation, Imperial Jet, Silver Air Private Jets, Israjets, and N2024D. The private plane charges were mostly in July and August, with only an Israjet's charge showing up in September. N2024D was paid more than $700,000, more than any other entity in the DeSantis campaign's expense report. It was also one of the campaign's largest vendors in the second fundraising quarter and has allowed the DeSantis campaign and a supportive super PAC to essentially share the cost of private air travel by providing lower-cost airplane leases, an unusual arrangement underscoring how much DeSantis has relied on the super PAC to cover expenses. Biden highlights key investments in building its small-dollar donor program. President Biden's campaign said it raised $71 million in the third quarter, a haul that his team expects to dwarf the sums raised by the Republican field. But as the incumbent president, he has the advantage of collecting large checks from donors in partnership with the national and state parties in sums as large as $929,000. His total includes money from his campaign, the Democratic National Committee, and 3 joint fundraising committees, which can be used to support his re-election effort. Biden's campaign manager noted that the team has been investing heavily in building its grassroots program, beating their own expectations about small donors in the third quarter. But when adjusted for inflation, Biden's total falls short of what Barack Obama and Donald Trump raised at the same point in their re-election campaigns. The president's reports were not yet available Sunday night. Haley shows staying power after strong debate performance. Nikki Haley, the former South Carolina governor who has been on an upward trajectory after strong performances in the first 2 debates, reported $11.5 million in cash on hand at the beginning of October. Her campaign said $9.1 million of that cash could be used for the primary election, which would put her in a slightly better position than DeSantis, but the amount of money available for the primary rather than the general election could not immediately be verified with available FEC data on Sunday night. Overall, Haley raised $8.2 million between July and the end of September and spent only $3.4 million, giving her one of the lowest burn rates of the GOP candidates. That has helped fuel her argument to donors that she is carefully husbanding her cash to use it with maximum effect as the primaries draw closer. Challenging path to debate stage for Pence. Reviled by many Trump loyalists because of his refusal to overturn the 2020 presidential election results, a constitutional power he did not unilaterally have, Pence has struggled to build momentum for his presidential bid, both in polling and in fundraising. His reports so far this year have been surprisingly anemic for a former vice president. In his report filed Sunday, he raised nearly $3.4 million in the third quarter but spent nearly as much, leaving his campaign with nearly $1.2 million in cash. He gave $150,000 of his own money to the campaign and has more than $620,000 in debt. One of the biggest challenges he is facing is qualifying for the third debate on November 8 in Miami. To make the stage, Pence must prove to the Republican National Committee that he has 70,000 unique donors. Asked about his progress toward that goal last week, he replied, "We're working on it." About 44% of Pence's donors have given $200 or less to his bid, according to an analysis of his filing. Tim Scott's astonishing burn rate. Tim Scott's campaign and his allied committees have been among the biggest spenders in the 2024 race on television ads, even though he has gained very little traction in the polls. In the third quarter, he raised a modest $4.6 million, but spent an eye-popping $12.4 million. At the beginning of October, he had about $13.3 million in cash left. Christie team highlights a lean operation they hope will carry them to New Hampshire. Former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, the most outspoken Trump critic in the field, is pinning his hopes to a surprise finish in New Hampshire that could build momentum for his effort in the South Carolina primary. This quarter he raised almost $3.8 million and spent less than $1.5 million, ending the quarter with about $3.9 million in cash. His advisors argue that keeping their operation small will allow his campaign to go the distance as he focuses on New Hampshire and South Carolina. About a quarter of Christie's most recent haul came from small donors, and one of his top advisors said their lean, responsible operation will give them runway as the process moves closer to New Hampshire. Two other candidates who could face major difficulties in qualifying for the third primary debate are Hutchinson and Burgum. Hutchinson said he failed to meet the polling criteria set by the RNC to qualify for the most recent debate in California. He raised about $666,781 in the third quarter and reported $325,287 in cash available at the end of the period. Burgum, another long-shot contender, has largely supported his campaign through loans. Of the $11.8 million that his campaign raised through the second quarter, about $10.2 million was loaned to the campaign by the North Dakota governor, a former software entrepreneur. In the third quarter, he loaned another $2 million to his campaign, raising a total of $3.4 million. Burgum's campaign reported that it had $2.3 million in cash left at the end of September. Ramaswamy, a tech entrepreneur, also has loaned millions of dollars of his own money to his campaign. He raised $7.4 million in the third quarter and had more than $4.2 million in cash left at the end of September. Michael Scherer and Merrill Cornfield contributed to this report. Trump, under fire for Israel comments, proposes fresh crackdown on Muslim immigrants. The Republican polling leader responded to backlash for calling Hezbollah very smart by reviving a proposal for screening immigrants by ideology. Clive, Iowa, former President Donald Trump, condemned by his Republican rivals and others last week for calling Hezbollah militants very smart, responded Monday by proposing harsher restrictions on immigration based on ideology, targeting Hamas sympathizers and critics of Israel. In addition to blocking people from entering the country based on ideological screenings, Trump said he would revoke student visas and deport anti-Israel demonstrators. He also pledged to expand his travel ban on people from Muslim-majority countries and refuse refugees. "We will implement strong ideological screening for all immigrants to the United States," he announced Monday, according to prepared remarks. In addition, "we will aggressively deport resident aliens with jihadist sympathies." The proposals echoed Trump's 2016 campaign, when he seized on terrorist attacks in Europe to call for banning Muslim immigration, which turned into a ban on travel from several Muslim-majority countries when he became president. The Supreme Court eventually upheld a modified version of the policy. The position Trump articulated marked the latest move in the Republican presidential race to adopt a strict posture of barring refugees from the Gaza Strip amid war in the Middle East. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Republican, said over the weekend that the United States should not accept them, adding, "If you look at how they behave, not all of them are Hamas, but they are all anti-Semitic." He was referring to the Palestinian militant group whose deadly attack on Israel started the ongoing war. Trump joined that position on Monday, adding Syria, Somalia, Yemen and Libya to the list. "If you support Hamas or any ideology that's having to do with that or any of the other really sick thoughts that go through people's minds, very dangerous, you're disqualified," Trump said in the remarks he delivered. During his appearance, Trump joked about expelling Biden administration officials based on ideology. "I'd like to get them out too," he said. Democrats on Monday swiftly condemned Trump's latest remarks. Donald Trump is doubling down on the same Islamophobic rhetoric that has done nothing but sow chaos and breed violence, said Democratic National Committee Chairman Jamie Harrison in a statement. DeSantis also announced support for deporting some student demonstrators. "You don't have a right to be here on a visa," he said in an interview on Monday on Fox News Radio's Guy Benson show, when asked about foreign national students who support Hamas. He added, "You don't have a right to be studying in the United States. And we have a right to defend our people." Trump also proposed ideological tests during the 2016 campaign, leading when he became president to longer screening questionnaires and citizenship tests. Critics called the changes overly burdensome and discriminatory. Last week, Trump faced widespread criticism from his Republicans and Democrats after calling Hezbollah militants very smart and criticizing Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. DeSantis's campaign spokesman went so far as to call Trump's remarks disqualifying, while former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie called Trump a fool. Trump has previously promised to mount the largest domestic deportation operation in history, but he went further Monday by proposing to send immigration officers to pro-jihadist demonstrations. He also said he would revive his administration's controversial efforts to revoke citizenship from criminals, terrorists, and immigration cheaters and frauds. U.S. to appeal sentences of 5 Proud Boys in January 6 Capitol riot case. Prison terms were among the longest for January 6 defendants, but far below government recommendations. The government filed notice Monday that it was appealing the sentences of the 5 members of the far-right Proud Boys group convicted in the January 6 attack, the second such unusual notice by federal prosecutors after a similar filing in July indicating they would challenge the punishments handed down to 5 members of the Oath Keepers for their role in the Capitol riot. In both cases, the prosecutors were not required to file any explanation for their initial notices, but both cases could reflect government dissatisfaction with the length of the sentences, even though the Proud Boys' former leader Henry Enrique Tarrio received the longest sentence yet imposed for the January 6 Capitol riot and 3 other members received more than 15 years in prison. The U.S. Attorney's Office did not immediately respond to a request for comment Monday. But in the Oath Keepers case, a spokeswoman said the filing merely preserves our ability to appeal, suggesting speculation about the Justice Department's intentions was premature. The seditious conspiracy convictions of Tarrio and Oath Keepers founder Stuart Rhodes were among the most high-profile prosecutions for the Justice Department's sprawling January 6 investigation that targeted organized far-right groups and more than 1,000 others who attacked the Capitol as Congress met to confirm the 2020 Electoral College results. In both cases, the judges imposed sentences well below those recommended by the federal sentencing guidelines, which are only advisory. The prosecution's practice in most January 6 sentencings has been to calculate the guideline range, which combines a defendant's criminal history and the seriousness of the offense, and then propose a sentence in the middle of that range. The judges then calculate their own guideline range, and can go within, above or below that range. In nearly 60% of the January 6 felony cases, the D.C. judges have gone below their own calculated guideline range, and below the prosecution's sentencing recommendations in 80% of all cases, according to a Washington Post database. Sentencing guidelines are not used in most misdemeanor cases. In the Proud Boys case, prosecutors calculated that Tarrio, the leader of the group, should have a sentencing range of 30 years to life, and recommended a term of 33 years. But U.S. District Judge Timothy J. Kelly, a Trump appointee, calculated Tarrio's range at 27 to 34 years in prison, and then gave him a sentence of 22 years. Judges are not required to explain why they deviate from the guidelines, as they were when the guidelines were mandatory. The Supreme Court made the guidelines advisory in 2005. Kelly acted similarly with the other 4 convicted Proud Boys members. Prosecutors sought a term of 33 years for Joseph Biggs, who was on the front lines of the January 6 attack, and Kelly sentenced him to 17 years. Prosecutors sought 27 years for Ethan Nordine, Kelly gave him 18 years. Prosecutors sought terms of 30 years and 20 years for Zachary Rell and Dominic Petzola, Kelly imposed terms of 15 and 10 years, respectively. Nordine's 18-year sentence equaled the term given to Rhodes, the second longest January 6 sentence, after Tarrio. Biggs's and Rell's terms are the next longest of the more than 650 sentences handed down to January 6 defendants so far. Attorney Norman Pattis, who represented Rell and Petzola at their sentencings, said in an email after the notice was filed, Merrick Garland is unhinged. Period. Call him the Inspector Javert of the DOJ. He should take up bungee jumping. This is no longer my government. Nicholas Smith, Nordine's lawyer, said in an email that his client is encouraged by the government's agreement that errors led to the judgment and sentence in his case. Tarrio's and Biggs's attorneys did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Supreme Court again leaves Biden administration's ghost gun rules in place. The Supreme Court on Monday once again reinstated the Biden administration's regulations on ghost guns, firearms assembled from kits without the usual serial numbers and background checks on purchasers. The administration's regulations, which apply to self-made weapons the same kind of licensing and record-keeping required of guns sold commercially, will remain in place while legal battles continue. There were no noted dissents in the ensigned order, which was necessary because of contrary rulings from lower courts. In August, the Supreme Court on a 5-4 vote allowed the Biden administration's regulations to stay in effect. But after the order was issued, U.S. District Judge Reed O'Connor of Texas again stepped in to block the regulations as applied to 2 manufacturers who supply a large number of the kits sold nationwide. A panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit largely upheld that ruling. The Biden administration told the Supreme Court the lower courts had flouted its August order, and again asked the justices to intervene. The District Court and the Fifth Circuit have effectively countermanded this court's authoritative determination about the status quo that should prevail while legal challenges continue, Solicitor General Elizabeth B. Prelogar said in a filing. She added, the court should not tolerate that affront to basic principles of judicial review. In the ensigned, one-paragraph order in August, Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr. and fellow conservative Justice Amy Coney Barrett joined liberal Justices Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan and Ketanji Brown Jackson in approving the government's plea to reinstate the restrictions. Conservatives Clarence Thomas, Samuel A. Alito Jr., Neil M. Gorsuch and Brett M. Kavanaugh noted they would have denied the government's request. Neither side explained its reasoning. Ghost guns are becoming increasingly popular with teenagers and those whose criminal records keep them from buying guns in the marketplace. Ghost gun sales and their use in violent crimes have spiked sharply in recent years, law enforcement agencies say. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF, imposed new regulations on the weapons under the Gun Control Act of 1968. Those regulations, Prelogar told the Supreme Court, do not prohibit buying or selling kits to assemble weapons. Instead, they require complying with the same regulations that concern commercial gun sales, such as obtaining licenses, marking products with serial numbers, conducting background checks, and keeping records to allow law enforcement to trace firearms used in crimes. But O'Connor in rulings has said the regulations exceed ATF's authority. The liberty interests of law-abiding citizens wishing to engage in historically lawful conduct, building their own weapons, outweighs the government's competing interest in preventing prohibited persons from unlawfully possessing firearms, he wrote in one. The Fifth Circuit considered the merits of O'Connor's ruling at a hearing on September 7, but has not issued a decision. In the meantime, O'Connor granted a new motion against ATF rules at the behest of two companies, Blackhawk Manufacturing and Defense Distributed, and said they could continue sales. His view was that the Supreme Court's order covered only his decision to halt the regulations nationwide, and that he could continue to provide relief to individual companies that showed their livelihoods were threatened. Prelogar said the companies and the lower courts were trying to take advantage of wording in the Supreme Court's August order to undermine its clear implications. But in its filing, Blackhawk's lawyers said the court's August order was focused on the nationwide implications of ATF's regulations. Based upon Blackhawk's reading of the plain language of the stay order, it not only was permitted but was required to return to the district court to seek relief to preserve its ability to stay in business, the filing said. Both the district court and the Court of Appeals agreed. This in no way constituted an affront to basic principles of judicial review. The case is Garland v. Blackhawk. Judge Chutkan issues limited gag order for Trump in D.C. January 6 case. U.S. District Judge Tanya S. Chutkan said Monday she will impose a limited gag order on former President Donald Trump in advance of his election interference trial, as requested by prosecutors. The gag order, she said in a ruling issued from the bench after a hearing, will prohibit all parties from statements publicly targeting special counsel Jack Smith, his staff, her staff or any other court personnel. Statements about the families of those individuals are absolutely prohibited as well. Even before the order was issued, Trump's lawyer John Lauro said they would appeal any such order, as it would affect important free speech principles, particularly for a leading candidate for president. Trump can argue that this prosecution is politically motivated, the judge said, but he cannot disparage the prosecutor by calling him a thug or vilify and implicitly encourage violence against public servants who are simply doing their jobs. She is also barring Trump and all parties from making statements about witnesses in the case. 17 FLA officers accused of stealing nearly $500,000 in COVID relief funds. In November 2021, the Broward Sheriff's Office in Florida received a tip from one of its deputies, claiming that their colleagues may have committed fraud to get loans from a federal pandemic relief fund. The tip led officials to a raft of falsified IRS tax forms, business records, and loan applications submitted by Broward deputies, federal officials in South Florida announced Thursday. In total, officers fraudulently obtained nearly $500,000 from the Paycheck Protection Program and Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program intended to provide relief during the global pandemic, investigators said. 17 Broward deputies were charged with wire fraud as a result of the investigation, according to federal and local officials. 8 work in law enforcement for the sheriff's office, and 9 work in the office's Department of Detention, according to a sheriff's office's news release. 2 sergeants were among those charged. The wave of indictments is one of the largest to hit a South Florida agency since the 1980s, the South Florida Sun-Sentinel reported. We were not going to leave one stone unturned and provide an opportunity for an employee to violate their oath and create embarrassment for this organization, Broward County Sheriff Gregory Toney said. The Broward Sheriff's Office did not respond to a request for comment Thursday night. Court records and news reports do not identify attorneys for many of the accused deputies, and attempts to reach most of them directly were unsuccessful. The Broward Deputy Sheriff's Association, which represents law enforcement deputies in the county, said in a statement that it was aware of the investigation but did not comment directly on the allegations. Employees and all citizens are entitled to and shall receive due process through the court system, the union said. Brian Silber, an attorney representing 2 indicted deputies, said in an email that there's more to the stories than what is being presented. Jude Faxedomo, an attorney representing a detention deputy charged with 2 counts of wire fraud, asserted that the indictments are misleading. Many of these deputies have legitimate side businesses for which they applied for the loan, Faxedomo said in a statement. More importantly, many relied on persons misrepresenting themselves as legitimate experts in PPP loans who prepared and submitted the applications on their behalf. Those people should be the government's real target. Some detention deputies last week contacted the Federation of Public and Private Employees, a union that protects detention deputies in Broward County, after they lost their guns, badges, and uniforms amid suspensions, the Sun-Sentinel reported. The majority of detention deputies are hardworking, good people, Tony Marciano, a business representative for the union, told the newspaper. People make mistakes. The deputies charged did not commit the alleged fraud in the course of their official duties, U.S. Attorney Mackenzie LaPointe said at a news conference Thursday. But he stressed the severity of defrauding the oft-exploited emergency government relief programs and said federal investigators would continue to pursue those who took advantage of it. There is a reckoning, LaPointe said. The cases represent the latest charges brought against people accused of misappropriating COVID relief funds. The government struggled to track the trillions of dollars it distributed during the pandemic in hopes of helping small businesses, unemployed workers, and families in need, a Washington Post investigation found. Fraudsters stole identities to obtain cash, while some politicians used the funds for projects unrelated to the pandemic, the Post has reported. Companies that didn't need extra funding found loopholes to acquire government funds. According to court documents, the Broward officers received fraudulent loans by submitting false information about their payrolls, gross revenue or income of personal companies, and IRS tax returns. Some officers then allegedly sought forgiveness for their loans. LaPointe said when he learned of the level of alleged fraud happening in the same office, "My first reaction was, there must have been some sort of conspiracy." But LaPointe said there was no evidence of a coordinated effort among the charged officers. The coincidence probably spoke to the vulnerability of large-scale relief programs to be targeted by bad actors, he said. When you have a federal program that's being offered to provide relief to a large number of people, you are always going to have opportunistic individuals who are going to try to take advantage of it, LaPointe said. Tony, the sheriff, said the charged officers would receive due process before being disciplined but indicated that they would not remain with the sheriff's office. At the end of the day, they will be gone, Tony said. If they're being criminally charged, there's no place for this in this organization. Charles Edward Littlejohn leaked thousands of tax returns from wealthy people, leading to exposés in the New York Times and ProPublica. A financial consultant who performed contract work for the IRS pleaded guilty Thursday to leaking reams of confidential tax returns filed by the wealthiest Americans, including those of then-President Donald Trump. Charles Edward Littlejohn, 38, admitted in D.C. federal court that he obtained thousands of individuals' tax returns by accessing an IRS database, and then leaked the materials to the New York Times and ProPublica beginning in 2019. The news organizations published blockbuster reports based on the trove of data, showing how Trump and the wealthiest Americans employed financial strategies to slash their federal tax bills, in some cases down to zero. At a plea hearing Thursday, Littlejohn admitted he leaked Trump's tax returns to the Times, which published articles based on the data in the months before the 2020 election. The returns of other wealthy individuals, including tech billionaires Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Elon Musk, became the basis of reports in ProPublica, analyzing how the richest Americans managed to evade the federal government's tax bite. Bezos owns the Washington Post. The unprecedented leak of Americans' confidential financial data renewed a debate in Congress about tax policy amid historic levels of income inequality, and served as an X-ray into Trump's secretive finances after years in which he waged legal battles to protect their confidentiality. U.S. District Judge Aneth C. Reyes rebuked Littlejohn several times from the bench and said whatever ends he had could not justify his means. "I cannot overstate how troubled I am by what occurred," Reyes said. After an attorney for Trump, Alina Habba, delivered a statement in court calling for the maximum prison sentence of 5 years for Littlejohn, the judge said, "I agree completely that people taking the law into their own hands is unacceptable. It doesn't matter who the person is who was the victim of a crime," Reyes said, before mentioning Trump by name and telling Habba that the former president could come deliver his own statement at Littlejohn's sentencing, set for January 29. "Everyone can be well assured that there will be serious consequences for this illegal act," Reyes said. In a news release, the Justice Department said Littlejohn tried to hide his tracks and saved the tax returns to multiple personal storage devices before contacting one of the media outlets. After sending a second batch of tax return information to another news organization, Littlejohn then obstructed the forthcoming investigation into his conduct by deleting and destroying evidence of his disclosures, the Justice Department said. By using his role as a government contractor to gain access to private tax information, steal that information, and disclose it publicly, Charles Littlejohn broke federal law and betrayed the public's trust, Attorney General Merrick Garland said in a statement. Littlejohn's attorney, Lisa Manning, declined to comment after the hearing. Speaking on behalf of Trump, Habba urged the Justice Department to investigate whether Littlejohn acted alone or in concert with others. She called the Trump-related leak an atrocity and an egregious breach by an agent of the IRS for political gain. Littlejohn worked for a private company performing contract work for the IRS, according to federal prosecutors. Neither the Justice Department nor Littlejohn's defense has identified the company. The Times report, Habba noted, was published in September 2020, months before Trump lost re-election to Joe Biden. Habba said Trump probably lost thousands of votes because of the leak. In its article on Trump, The Times said, all of the information The Times obtained was provided by sources with legal access to it. Charlie Stadlander, a Times spokesman, said in an email Thursday night, "We remain concerned when whistleblowers who provide information in the public interest are prosecuted." The Times' reporting on this topic played an important role in helping the public understand the financial ties and tax strategies of a sitting president, information that has long been seen as central to the knowledge that voters should have about the leader of our government and the candidates for that high office. In a court filing, federal prosecutors from the Justice Department's Public Integrity Section said only a subset of the thousands of leaked tax returns, covering at least 152 victims, had been published by the media as a result of the charged unauthorized disclosure. ProPublica is not disclosing how it obtained the data, which was given to us in raw form, with no conditions or conclusions, the news organization said in one report. In another, the media outlet added, "We do not know the identity of our source. We did not solicit the information they sent us." A spokesperson for ProPublica declined to comment Thursday. Reyes noted that the House Committee on Ways and Means had obtained 5 years of Trump's tax returns, covering 2015 to 2020, after prevailing in a years-long legal battle that began under a different judge in the same D.C. courthouse. "This is how we do things in this country. We have laws," Reyes said. "And a court decides what is permitted and what is not permitted." Illegal disclosures such as Littlejohn's could imperil the government's ability to collect taxes, if individuals can't trust their financials will be kept confidential, the judge said. Under federal law, the Justice Department usually would be required to notify each victim of a crime individually. But prosecutors said in a court filing that the large number of potential crime victims in this case makes it impracticable to notify them on an individualized basis, and the judge granted their request to publish mass notices instead on a Justice Department website. Spencer S. Sue and Devlin Barrett contributed to this report. Supreme Court seems inclined to reinstate disputed South Carolina map. The redrawn congressional map moved whites in and blacks out. But the legislature said those decisions focused on political party, not race. The Supreme Court on Wednesday seemed likely to reinstate a South Carolina congressional map drawn by the GOP majority legislature that a lower court found exiled 30,000 black voters to create a district safer for a white Republican incumbent. Just a few months ago, the justices found that Alabama had illegally drawn its congressional map to dilute the power of black voters. But on Wednesday, the question was whether South Carolina's new map, which moved black voters from one congressional district to another, was a permissible gerrymander to bolster the Republican majority or an unconstitutional attempt to sort voters by race. Chief Justice John G. Roberts, Jr., who wrote the Alabama decision last term, said disentangling race and politics in gerrymandering cases is very, very difficult when voting is polarized along both racial and political lines. Black voters and organizations challenging the South Carolina maps, he said, had no direct evidence that racial data, rather than political data, dominated. Have we ever had a case before where all it is circumstantial evidence? Roberts asked Leah C. Aden of the Legal Defense Fund, which is representing the challengers. He added, "I'm not saying you can't get there, but it does seem that this would be breaking new ground in our voting rights jurisprudence." The case is one of several across the country in which courts are considering challenges to congressional redistricting plans, enough that their eventual rulings could play a large role in determining which party controls the U.S. House after the 2024 elections. In the Alabama case, Roberts and Justice Brett M. Kavanaugh joined the court's three liberals to form a majority, finding the state's plan violated the Voting Rights Act by not creating a second congressional district, out of 7 in the state, where black voters made up a large enough share of the electorate to have a strong chance of electing their candidate of choice. Tuesday's South Carolina case was in some sense the flip side of that decision, examining whether the maps violated the Constitution's bar on using race as an unjustified and predominant factor in drawing districts. A 3-judge panel in January said the map illegally split black neighborhoods in the Charleston area. Representative Nancy Mace, Republican, South Carolina, who had squeaked by her Democratic opponent in 2020, coasted to victory in 2022 in the redrawn district, keeping her seat in what has become the state's 6-1 Republican-dominated congressional delegation. The strategies ultimately exiled over 30,000 African American citizens from their previous district and created a stark racial gerrymander of Charleston County and the city of Charleston, said the panel of judges, 2 nominated by President Barack Obama and 1 by President Biden. The judges, quoting from testimony at trial, found that the changes were dramatic and created tremendous disparity in the placement of African Americans in 2 congressional districts, Mace's and the district represented by Representative James E. Clyburn, the assistant Democratic House leader. The judges found that South Carolina's mapmaker tried to keep the African American population below a certain target in Mace's district, treating Charleston County in a fundamentally different way than the rest of the state. Washington lawyer John M. Gore, representing South Carolina, said the lower court panel had made numerous missteps and one fundamental one. The legislature achieved its political goals by moving Republicans into the district and Democrats out of the district, Gore said. All of the direct evidence confirms that it used political data, not racial data, to identify Republicans and Democrats. The liberal justices said that just was not so. The lower court held a trial, weighed evidence, and judged the credibility of each side's experts, Justice Elena Kagan said. And the court said no, the evidence showed that you were doing race as a proxy for politics. Justice Sonia Sotomayor agreed, asking detailed questions about whether white Democrats were treated differently from black Democrats. The numbers are incredible, she said. Much of the hearing was focused on those types of specifics. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson said the Supreme Court's role should be only to decide whether the lower court had made a clear legal error in its ruling. But conservative Justice Samuel A. Alito Jr. said that was different from simply deferring to the lower court. Finding clear error is a very demanding standard, but it is not an impossible standard, Alito said. And it doesn't mean that we simply rubber stamp findings by a district court, particularly in a case like this, where we are the only court that is going to be reviewing those findings. Alito and Kavanaugh asked questions about the methodology of the experts and details about moving voters in certain neighborhoods from Mace's district to Clyburn's, and vice versa. Justice Neil M. Gorsuch questioned Justice Department lawyer Caroline A. Flynn, who supported the black challengers, about a passage in the government's brief that said it would have been plausible for the district court to have come to the exact opposite conclusion it came to here, meaning that race did not predominate. Kavanaugh followed up. You've looked at this record and you obviously concluded that the district court could have said no, that expert evidence is not sufficiently reliable or probative in light of the overall record to support the plaintiff's case? He asked. Well, we think that the expert evidence is a big part of it, Flynn responded. We think that there were credibility findings here that might have come out differently with a different three-judge panel, possibly. It's kind of hard to tell, because we weren't there seeing the witnesses firsthand. The state has asked the justices to decide Alexander versus South Carolina State Conference of the NAACP by the end of the year because of the approaching 2024 primaries. Trump, under fire for Israel comments, proposes fresh crackdown on Muslim immigrants. The Republican polling leader responded to backlash for calling Hezbollah very smart by reviving a proposal for screening immigrants by ideology. Clive, Iowa, former President Donald Trump, condemned by his Republican rivals and others last week for calling Hezbollah militants very smart, responded Monday by proposing harsher restrictions on immigration based on ideology, targeting Hamas sympathizers and critics of Israel. In addition to blocking people from entering the country based on ideological screenings, Trump said he would revoke student visas and deport anti-Israel demonstrators. He also pledged to expand his travel ban on people from Muslim-majority countries and refuse refugees. We will implement strong ideological screening for all immigrants to the United States, he announced Monday, according to prepared remarks. In addition, we will aggressively deport resident aliens with jihadist sympathies. The proposals echoed Trump's 2016 campaign, when he seized on terrorist attacks in Europe to call for banning Muslim immigration, which turned into a ban on travel from several Muslim-majority countries when he became president. The Supreme Court eventually upheld a modified version of the policy. The position Trump articulated marked the latest move in the Republican presidential race to adopt a strict posture of barring refugees from the Gaza Strip amid war in the Middle East. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Republican, said over the weekend that the United States should not accept them, adding, "If you look at how they behave, not all of them are Hamas, but they are all anti-Semitic." He was referring to the Palestinian militant group whose deadly attack on Israel started the ongoing war. Trump joined that position on Monday, adding Syria, Somalia, Yemen and Libya to the list. If you support Hamas or any ideology that's having to do with that or any of the other really sick thoughts that go through people's minds, very dangerous, you're disqualified, Trump said in the remarks he delivered. During his appearance, Trump joked about expelling Biden administration officials based on ideology. "I'd like to get them out too," he said. Democrats on Monday swiftly condemned Trump's latest remarks. Donald Trump is doubling down on the same Islamophobic rhetoric that has done nothing but sow chaos and breed violence, said Democratic National Committee Chairman Jamie Harrison in a statement. DeSantis also announced support for deporting some student demonstrators. "You don't have a right to be here on a visa," he said in an interview on Monday on Fox News Radio's Guy Benson show, when asked about foreign national students who support Hamas. He added, "You don't have a right to be studying in the United States. And we have a right to defend our people." Trump also proposed ideological tests during the 2016 campaign, leading when he became president to longer screening questionnaires and citizenship tests. Critics called the changes overly burdensome and discriminatory. Last week, Trump faced widespread criticism from his Republicans and Democrats after calling Hezbollah militants very smart and criticizing Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. DeSantis's campaign spokesman went so far as to call Trump's remarks disqualifying, while former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie called Trump a fool. Trump has previously promised to mount the largest domestic deportation operation in history, but he went further Monday by proposing to send immigration officers to pro-jihadist demonstrations. He also said he would revive his administration's controversial efforts to revoke citizenship from criminals, terrorists, and immigration cheaters and frauds. Trump-backed candidate wins Louisiana governor's race. Jeff Landry, who also had the endorsement of Representative Steve Scalise, Republican, Louisiana, received 52% of the vote, avoiding the need for a runoff. Louisiana Attorney General Jeff Landry, a Republican with strong ties to former President Donald Trump, won his state's gubernatorial race on Saturday night, a major victory for the GOP in a southern state that has been run by Democratic Governor John Bel Edwards for the last 8 years. Landry received nearly 52% of the votes among a crowded field of candidates in the state's open primary. Under this system, all candidates, regardless of party, run in the same election. If no candidate had received the majority of the vote, the two top candidates would compete in a runoff under Louisiana law. But because Landry did receive more than 50%, he fended off a second round and is Louisiana governor-elect. A staunch supporter of Trump and a hardline Republican, Landry ran his campaign on a tough-on-crime platform and has consistently pushed conservative policies in the state, including a ban on gender-affirming medical care for transgender youth and a near-total abortion ban. The state's contentious abortion ban has no exemptions for rape or incest. Landry also was among the 19 state attorneys general who signed a letter in June demanding that the Biden administration allow their offices access to information about residents who received gender-affirming or abortion care in other states. Edwards could not run again because of term limits. Democratic candidate and former Louisiana Transportation Secretary Shawn Wilson was the second finisher in the race, receiving slightly more than 25% of the vote, according to unofficial results from the Louisiana Secretary of State's office. While 7 other Republicans ran for the governor's office, Landry received Trump's endorsement in the race, as well as the backing of Representative Steve Scalise, Republican, Louisiana, a stalwart of Louisiana Republican politics. On Saturday, Landry, 52, thanked those who backed him, saying that his election is a sign that his state is united and it's a wake-up call. It's a message that everyone should hear loud and clear that we the people in this state are going to expect more out of our government from here on, he said. Edwards has clashed with Landry repeatedly on issues including LGBTQ rights and the death penalty. On Saturday night, Edwards congratulated his soon-to-be successor, adding that Landry ran a winning campaign focused on uniting the people of Louisiana across political and social divides and addressing important kitchen table issues. In my experience, that's the best way to govern, Edwards said in a statement. A smooth transition of power following an election is a core tenet of American democracy. My staff and I will ensure the incoming administration has every opportunity to be ready on day one. Landry has served as Louisiana Attorney General since 2016. Before that, he represented the state's 3rd district in the U.S. House of Representatives. Landry's win marks a major victory for the Republican Party, as it will now take back the governor's mansion in one of the few states in the Deep South run by Democrats. Edwards gained much national attention after his surprise victory in 2015 after 2 rounds in the gubernatorial race.